Hi everyone. Let's start with one simple idea. In many countries, the state is basically expected to be a referee, blow the whistle, keep order, and stop people from committing crimes or bad policy decisions. But in South Korea, the state has usually been expected to do much more than that. It is not just the referee. It is also the coach, the team manager, the strength trainer, the emergency contact, and somehow the person who still has to clean up after the game. Historically, many Koreans have expected the state not only to provide safety, but also to guide development, manage risk, and jump in the moment things start going sideways. So the government is often judged less like a quiet background institution, and more like the one group project member who is expected to do all the work while everyone else supports emotionally. That is why efficiency, discipline, and competence matter so much in Korea. People are not asking the state to just exist politely in the corner. They are asking it to perform. So before we get into the economy or politics, we first need to understand this basic expectation. What exactly do people think the state is supposed to do? And why are the expectations set at a level usually reserved for K-pop idols and firstborn children? Let me give you the roadmap for today so nobody feels like we accidentally wandered into a philosophy seminar and can't find the exit. We are going through 4 connected parts, and together they explain why the Korean state has often been seen as both powerful and weirdly necessary. First, we will look at the state itself and the idea of gong. It usually gets translated as the public good, which sounds straightforward, but of course it is not straightforward, because political theory never misses a chance to make one word behave like 5 words. Second, we will compare Korea with China and Japan. That part matters because even when the ideas sound similar, they do not mean exactly the same thing, which is academically fascinating and personally offensive. Third, we will look at nationalism, historical trauma, and family-centered values, and how all of those helped shape modern Korean statism. Basically, history, feelings, and social structure all got together and said, let's make this complicated. And finally, we get to the biggest plot twist. The Korean government often feels huge, but by some measurements it is not actually that huge. So this is not just a list of concepts. It is really a story about how history, morality, politics, and culture formed a very intense and slightly exhausting relationship. To understand Korean political culture, we really have to start with statism. And no, I do not just mean loving your country so much that you would dramatically salute a mountain at sunrise. I mean a way of thinking where the state is given a very big role in social and political life. The state is seen as the main actor that keeps order, represents the collective, and makes the big decisions. In Korean history, this was closely tied to the idea of gong, or the public. But gong was not just some dry legal term hiding in a dusty book and hoping nobody would ask questions. It had moral weight. It meant something bigger than private interest, bigger than what's in it for me. That is why public opinion, or gongron, mattered so much. It was not just about counting who yelled the loudest on the Joseon version of social media. It was about identifying a legitimate shared judgment before major action was taken. So the state did not rule just by force. It also needed legitimacy. And that legitimacy depended on whether people believed it was actually serving the public good. So when we talk about Korean statism, we are really talking about a political culture where authority comes with a moral job description, and frankly, a lot of performance pressure. One key figure here is Yulgok Yiwon, one of the most famous scholars of the Joseon period. He argued that there is such a thing as a broadly shared standard of right judgment, sometimes called kuksi, or a national standard. In simpler terms, he is saying that some principles are so basic and so important that ordinary people can recognize them without needing a 400-page theory book, a study group, and an academic breakdown. From this perspective, true public opinion is not just the loudest person in the room winning by volume, confidence, and refusal to sit down. And it is not simply whatever the most powerful people want. It is the judgment that emerges when selfish interests are pushed aside and people focus on what is right for the community as a whole. That matters because it gives public opinion moral significance. It is not just politically useful. It is ethically meaningful. And the idea of gong itself has a long history. It seems to have developed from early practices of sharing resources and later became tied to governance and authority. So from early on it carried this double meaning, fairness on one side, power on the other, which, if we are being honest, is the most state-like combination imaginable. If we compare Korea and China, we see a really important similarity. In both traditions, gong, or the public, became an ethical ideal. It was set against sa, which meant selfish or narrow private interest. So basically, the moral message was, please do not run the country like it is your personal group chat, family business, or revenge fantasy. A ruler was not supposed to govern for personal gain, or just help a tiny inner circle of favorites. A ruler was supposed to act for the wider community and represent the public good. And if that standard was broken, the problem was not just administrative, like oops, the paperwork got weird. It was moral. Bad government was not just inefficient. It was ethically wrong. That is why criticism of rulers was often expressed in moral language. A corrupt government was not just bad at its job. It was failing as a legitimate authority and, frankly, embarrassing itself spiritually. So yes, power could be strong, but it was not supposed to be shamelessly self-serving. It had to come with a moral justification. That helps explain why the state in Korea could be powerful without being seen as totally above judgment. Japan developed a somewhat different idea of the public. The term uyake did not become an abstract moral principle in quite the same way that gong did in Korea and China. Instead, it stayed more closely tied to the state, the political order, and especially the authority of the ruler. And that difference really matters. In the Japanese tradition described here, the ideal response to authority was stronger obedience and loyalty. The ruler stood above ordinary people more clearly, and the line between ruler and ruled was more fixed. So there was less room for people to say, respectfully, Your Majesty, this plan seems deeply questionable and may be cursed. In Korea, by contrast, there was more room to judge rulers based on whether they were actually serving the public good. That does not mean Korea was a modern democracy, obviously. Nobody was live tweeting cabinet debates. But it does mean authority was more clearly tied to a moral test. And that matters because it reminds us that East Asia was not running on one single political template. Same region, similar vocabulary, very different operating systems. Korea's strong central state did not suddenly pop into existence in the modern era like a surprise app update nobody asked for. Its roots go back much earlier. Starting from the Three Kingdoms period, political authority in Korea tended to move in a more centralized direction. That pattern continued through the Goryeo and Joseon dynasties, where the central government played a major role in administration, law, taxation, and political order. The details changed over time, of course, but the bigger pattern stayed pretty consistent. When in doubt, send it to the center and let someone in a hat make it official. Later, colonial rule and the Korean War caused enormous suffering and disruption. But instead of destroying this centralizing tendency, those crises often reinforced it. In times of survival and reconstruction, centralized coordination looked less like a preference and more like the only adult in the room. And that matters, because when South Korea entered rapid modernization and industrialization, it already had a long tradition of strong state organization to build on. So the developmental state did not appear out of thin air. It had a long and very bureaucratic origin story. The 20th century was a really rough time for Korea. Colonial rule, militarization, and the Korean War left deep scars on society. Life was shaped by emergency, discipline, and survival. Obviously, none of that was good. No one looks at war and says, terrible human suffering but excellent project management. But these painful experiences did leave behind institutions and habits that later influenced economic development. In particular, top-down organization, rapid mobilization, and strict coordination became familiar ways of handling national problems. So when South Korea shifted toward industrialization, a lot of those same methods were redirected toward growth. The state set priorities, coordinated resources, pushed key industries, and demanded fast results, like a very stressed manager with national authority. That helps explain part of the so-called miracle on the Han River. Economic growth was not just the magic of markets. It also depended on a state that could organize and accelerate development very aggressively. So the point is not that trauma somehow magically produces success. The point is that crisis shaped the state's capacity, and later that capacity became a big part of Korea's development story. History, once again, was helpful in the most emotionally inconvenient way possible. Another big reason Korean statism became so strong is nationalism. In Korea, the sense of community has often gone beyond the village or local area and expanded to the nation as a whole. The nation is often imagined as one shared moral community with a common history, culture, and destiny. Confucian values reinforce that idea by linking social order to family relationships. Because of that, the state could be seen not as some cold outside institution, but more like an extension of a much larger family structure. And once politics start sounding like family, everything immediately becomes more emotional, more complicated, and somehow louder. This made collective sacrifice easier to justify. If the nation is like a family, and the state represents that family at the highest level, then enduring hardship for national goals can start to feel like a moral duty, instead of just a very tiring policy demand. That does not mean everyone agreed all the time, of course. Families argue. Nations argue louder and with better flags. But it does help explain why strong state leadership could gain broad social acceptance. Nationalism and familism work together to give emotional and ethical support to a powerful state, which is a very efficient way to make politics feel both sacred and impossible to escape. Survey data helps us see how these values still show up today. Compared with global averages, Koreans tend to put more responsibility on the government and less on the individual when it comes to solving major social problems. That does not mean individuals do not matter. It just means many people see the state as the one actor that is supposed to show up, take responsibility, and actually fix things, instead of giving a motivational speech and disappearing. Basically, the expectation is not just, please keep order. It is more like, please keep order. Manage the crisis, stabilize society, and ideally do it before lunch because we have other problems. At the same time, national pride in Korea is also quite strong. So when you put those together, you get a very interesting combination. People strongly identify with the nation, and they also expect a lot from the state. Which means when the government performs well, people notice. But when it fails, the disappointment is not mild. It is cinematic. These survey results matter because they show that the state is still seen as central to the public good in contemporary Korea. In other words, the state is not just part of the system. It is the person everyone keeps tagging when something goes wrong. This brings us to one of the most interesting paradoxes in Korean politics. On the one hand, support for democracy is real and important. People care about legitimacy, and they want leaders to be chosen through proper political procedures. But on the other hand, there is also strong support for decisive leadership. In other words, people want democracy, but they would also really appreciate it if democracy could stop taking the scenic route. Many people want a government that can act quickly, solve problems efficiently, and respond forcefully in a crisis. So the tension here is not simply democracy versus authoritarianism. It is the desire to combine democratic legitimacy with strong state capacity. In practice, that means people may support elections and public debate, but still get frustrated when the process starts feeling slow, messy, and emotionally attached to not making decisions. The ideal leader, in this view, is strong, competent, fast, and still politically legitimate. Basically, please respect democratic procedure, but also please do not turn every urgent issue into a four-season drama with no ending. Even though the Korean state was often strong, we should not confuse that with unlimited monarchy. In the Korean tradition we are discussing, a ruler's authority was understood as conditional. In other words, the ruler was expected to govern in line with gonggrong, or legitimate public opinion in a moral sense. If the ruler failed to serve the public good, then his authority was weakened in principle, even if ordinary people did not have modern political rights. That is quite different from the classic European image of absolute monarchy, where the ruler could basically say, I am the state, and everyone else had to nod like their dental coverage depended on it. In Korea, the ruler was powerful, but he was not supposed to stand above moral judgment. He had an ethical job description, which is a terrible thing to put on a king if you enjoy peace and quiet. That matters because it shows that even strong state traditions can include internal limits. They were not modern constitutional checks, of course, but they still shaped how power was justified and criticized. So this is not a story of unlimited rule. It is more like powerful rule with a permanent moral performance review and very opinionated auditors. These limits on authority were not just philosophical decoration. They were backed up by real institutions and real practices. In earlier periods, bodies like the Hwabak Council played important roles in political decision-making. During the Joseon dynasty, ministers and oversight officials could also criticize the ruler and question policy. One especially important example is the system of censorial and inspector institutions, including bodies such as the Sahyonbu. Their job was to monitor officials, call out wrongdoing, and help prevent abuses of power. So yes, ancient Korea really did have people whose full-time role was basically to say, absolutely not, Your Majesty, try again. Now, this was obviously not democracy in the modern sense. The system was not fully open or equal. But it does show that Korean political tradition had built-in mechanisms of accountability even within a strong state structure. There was also a local dimension. Even when the center was powerful, villages often kept meaningful room for self-management in everyday affairs. So the Korean state was not just a one-way command machine. It also included review, criticism, and local mediation. Basically, even back then, government meetings could still be delayed by people saying, I have concerns. In contemporary Korea, people still expect a lot of public discussion around major decisions. They want important policies to be explained clearly, debated openly, and justified in front of the public. So the older importance of legitimate public opinion is still there. Just now with more microphones, more camera angles, and definitely more online comments than anyone asked for. At the same time, Korea gives us a very interesting paradox. The government often feels extremely present in public life because expectations are so high. People look to it for coordination, crisis management, and national direction. But if we look at some comparative measures, Korea is not actually a very large government in terms of spending, taxation, or direct intervention in every corner of the economy. So the key point is this. Strong political centrality does not always mean a giant government in every measurable sense. In Korea, the state can feel socially and politically huge while still being relatively limited in some economic terms. That is why Korea can seem like a big government in responsibility and visibility, but a small government in certain comparisons. Which is honestly very on brand for this whole presentation. The government is somehow both everywhere, and, statistically speaking, not that everywhere. It is the political equivalent of someone who dominates the conversation, but still insists they are, quote, actually pretty low-key.